Chapter 3 of Captains Courageous. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This recording is by Mark Smith of Simpsonville, South Carolina. Captains Courageous by Rudyard Kipling. Chapter 3. It was the 40-fathom slumber that clears the soul and eye and heart, and sends you to breakfast ravening. They emptied a big tin dish of juicy fragments of fish, the blood ends the cook had collected overnight. They cleaned up the plates and pans of the elder mess, who were out fishing, sliced pork for the midday meal, swabbed down the forecastle, filled the lamps, drew coal and water for the cook, and investigated the forehold, where the boat's stores were stacked. It was another perfect day, soft, mild, and clear, and Harvey breathed to the very bottom of his lungs. More schooners had crept up in the night, and the long blue seas were full of sails and dories. Far away on the horizon, the smoke of some liner, her hull invisible, smudged the blue, and to eastward a big ship's topgallant sails, just lifting, made a square nick in it. Disco Troop was smoking by the roof of the cabin, one eye on the craft around, and the other on the little fly at the mainmast head.
"When Dad kerflummoxes that way," said Dan in a whisper, "he's doin' some high-line thinkin' for all hands. I'll lay my wage and share we'll make berth soon. Dad he knows the cod, and the fleet they know Dad knows. See 'em comin' up one by one, lookin' for nothin' in particular, o' course, but scrougin' on us all the time. There's the Prince Laboa, she's a Chatham boat. She's crep up since last night. And see that big one with a patch in her foresail and a new jib? She's the Carrie Pitman from West Chatham. She won't keep her canvas long on 'less her luck's changed since last season. She don't do much 'cept drift. There ain't an anchor mate'll hold her. When the smoke puffs up in little rings like that, Dad's studyin' the fish. If we speak to him now, he'll git mad. Last time I did, he just took and hove a boot at me." Disco Troop stared forward, the pipe between his teeth, with eyes that saw nothing. As his son said, he was studying the fish, pitting his knowledge and experience on the banks against the roving cod in his own sea. He accepted the presence of the inquisitive schooners on the horizon as a compliment to his powers, but now that it was paid he wished to draw away and make his berth alone, till it was time to go up to the Virgin and fish in the streets of that roaring town upon the waters. So Disco Troop thought of recent weather, and gales, currents, food supplies, and other domestic arrangements, from the point of view of a 20-pound cod, was, in fact, for an hour a cod himself, and looked remarkably like one. Then he removed the pipe from his teeth. "Dad," said Dan, "we've done our chores. Can't we go overside a piece? It's good catchin' weather."
"Not in that cherry-colored rig nor them half-baked brown shoes. Give him something fit to wear."
"Dad's pleased. That settles it,"
said Dan delightedly, dragging Harvey into the cabin, while Troop pitched a key down the steps.
"Dad keeps my spare rig where he can overhaul it, 'cause Ma says I'm keerless."
He rummaged through a locker, and in less than 3 minutes Harvey was adorned with fisherman's rubber boots that came half up his thigh, a heavy blue jersey well darned at the elbows, a pair of flippers, and a sou'wester.
"Now you look somethin' like," said Dan. "Hurry."
"Keep nigh and handy," said Troop, "and don't go visitin' round the fleet. If anyone asks you what I'm calculatin' to do, speak the truth, for you don't know." A little red dory, labeled Hattie S., lay astern of the schooner. Dan hauled in the painter and dropped lightly on to the bottom boards, while Harvey tumbled clumsily after.
"That's no way of getting into a boat," said Dan. "If there was any sea, you'd go to the bottom sure. You've got to learn to meet her."
Dan fitted the thole pins, took the forward thwart, and watched Harvey's work. The boy had rowed, in a ladylike fashion, on the Adirondack ponds, But there is a difference between squeaking pins and well-balanced rowlocks, light sculls and stubby 8-foot sea oars. They stuck in the gentle swell, and Harvey grunted.
"Short. Row short," said Dan. "If you cramp your oar in any kind of sea, you're liable to turn her over. Ain't she a daisy? Mine, too."
The little dory was specklessly clean. In her bows lay a tiny anchor, 2 jugs of water, and some 70 fathoms of thin, brown dory roding. A tin dinner horn rested in cleats just under Harvey's right hand, beside an ugly-looking maul, a short gaff, and a shorter wooden stick. A couple of lines, with very heavy leads and double cod-hooks, all neatly coiled on square reels, were stuck in their place by the gunwale.
"Where's the sail and mast?" said Harvey, for his hands were beginning to blister.
Dan chuckled.
"You don't sail fishing dories much. You pull, but you needn't pull so hard. Don't you wish you owned her?"
"Well, I guess my father might give me one or two if I asked him," Harvey replied. He had been too busy to think much of his family till then.
"That's so. I forgot your dad's a millionaire. You don't act millionairy any, now. But a dory and craft and gear," Dan spoke as though she were a whaleboat, "costs a heap. Think your dad'd give you one for a pet, like?"
"Shouldn't wonder. It would be most the only thing I haven't stuck him for yet."
"Must be a expensive kinder kid to home. Don't slitheroo that way, Harve. Short's the trick, because no sea's ever dead still, and the swells'll—" Crack!
The loom of the oar kicked Harvey under the chin and knocked him backward.
"That was what I was going to say. I had to learn, too, but I wasn't more than 8 years old when I got my schoolin'."
Harvey regained his seat with aching jaws and a frown.
"No good getting mad at things, Dad says. It's our own fault if we can't handle 'em, he says. Let's try here. Manuel'll give us the water."
The Portuguese was rocking fully a mile away, but when Dan upended an oar he waved his left arm 3 times.
30 fathom," said Dan, stringing a salt clam onto the hook. "Over with the doughboys. Bait same as I do, Harve, and don't snarl your reel."
Dan's line was out long before Harvey had mastered the mystery of baiting and heaving out the leads. The dory drifted along easily. It was not worth while to anchor till they were sure of good ground.
"Here we come!" Dan shouted, and a shower of spray rattled on Harvey's shoulders as a big cod flapped and kicked alongside. "Muckle, Harvey, muckle! Under your hand, quick!"
Evidently muckle could not be the dinner horn, so Harvey passed over the maul, and Dan scientifically stunned the fish before he pulled it inboard, and wrenched out the hook with a short wooden stick he called a gobstick. Then Harvey felt a tug, and pulled up zealously.
"Why, these are strawberries!" he shouted. "Look!"
The hook had fouled among a bunch of strawberries, red on one side and white on the other, perfect reproductions of the land fruit, except that there were no leaves, and the stem was all pipy and slimy.
"Don't touch 'em! Slat 'em off! Don't—"
The warning came too late. Harvey had picked them from the hook and was admiring them.
"Ouch!"
he cried, for his fingers throbbed as though he had grasped many nettles.
"Now you know what strawberry bottom means. Nothin' 'cept fish should be touched with the naked fingers, Dad says. Slat 'em off agin the gunwale, and bait up, Harve. Lookin' won't help any. It's all in the wages."
Harvey smiled at the thought of his $10.50 a month, and wondered what his mother would say if she could see him hanging over the edge of a fishing dory in mid-ocean. She suffered agonies whenever he went out on Saranac Lake, and by the way, Harvey remembered distinctly that he used to laugh at her anxieties. Suddenly the line flashed through his hand, stinging even through the flippers, the woolen circlets supposed to protect it.
"He's a logy! Give him room accordin' to his strength," cried Dan. "I'll help you." "No, you won't," Harvey snapped as he hung on to the line. "It's my first fish. Is it a whale?" "Halibut, maybe."
Dan peered down into the water alongside, and flourished the big muckle, ready for all chances. Something white and oval flickered and fluttered through the green.
"I'll lay my wage and share he's over 100. Are you so everlastin' anxious to land him alone?"
Harvey's knuckles were raw and bleeding where they had been banged against the gunwale. His face was purple-blue between excitement and exertion. He dripped with sweat, and was half blinded from staring at the circling sunlit ripples around the swiftly moving line. The boys were tired long ere the halibut, who took charge of them and the dory for the next 20 minutes. But the big flat fish was gaffed and hauled in at last.
"Beginner's luck," said Dan, wiping his forehead. "He's all of 100.
Harvey looked at the huge gray and mottled creature with unspeakable pride. He had seen halibut many times on marble slabs ashore, but it had never occurred to him to ask how they came inland. Now he knew, and every inch of his body ached with fatigue.
"If Dad was along," said Dan, hauling up, "he'd read the signs plain's print. The fish are runnin' smaller and smaller, and you've took about as logy a halibuts as we're apt to find this trip. Yesterday's catch, did you notice it? Was all big fish and no halibut. Dad, he's read them signs right off. Dad says everything on the banks is signs, and can be read wrong or right. Dad's deeper'n the whale hole."
Even as he spoke, someone fired a pistol on the We're Here, and a potato basket was run up in the fore-rigging.
"What did I say now? That's the call for the whole crowd. Dad's onter something, or he'd never break fishin' this time o' day. Reel up, Harve, and we'll pull back."
They were to windward of the schooner, just ready to flirt the dory over the still sea, when sounds of woe half a mile off led them to Penn, who was careering about a fixed point, for all the world like a gigantic water-bug. The little man backed away and came down again with enormous energy, but at the end of each maneuver his dory swung round and snubbed herself on her rope.
"We'll have to help him, else he'll root and seed here," said Dan.
"What's the matter?" said Harvey. This was a new world, where he could not lay down the law to his elders, but had to ask questions humbly. And the sea was horribly big and unexcited.
"Anchor's fouled. Penn's always losin' 'em. Lost 2 this trip already. On sandy bottom, too. And Dad says next one he loses, sure as fishin', he'll give him the kelleg. That'd break Penn's heart."
"What's a kelleg?" said Harvey, who had a vague idea it might be some kind of marine torture, like keel-hauling in the story-books.
"Big stone instead of an anchor. You can see a kelleg ridin' in the bows fur's you can see a dory, and all the fleet knows what it means. They'd guy him dreadful. Penn couldn't stand that no more'n a dog with a dipper to his tail. He's so everlastin' sensitive. Hello, Penn! Stuck again? Don't try any more of your patents. Come up on her and keep your rodin' straight up and down." "It doesn't move," said the little man, panting. "It doesn't move at all, and indeed I've tried everything." "What's all this hurrah's nest for'ard?" said Dan, pointing to a wild tangle of spare oars and dory roding, all matted together by the hand of inexperience. "Oh, that," said Penn proudly, "is a Spanish windlass. Mr. Salters showed me how to make it, but even that doesn't move her." Dan bent low over the gunwale to hide a smile, twitched once or twice on the roding, and behold, the anchor drew at once. "Haul up, Penn," he said, laughing, "or she'll get stuck again." They left him regarding the weed-hung flukes of the little anchor with big, pathetic blue eyes, and thanking them profusely. "Oh, say, while I think of it, Harve," said Dan, when they were out of earshot, "Penn ain't quite all caulked. He ain't nowise dangerous, but his mind's give out. See?"
"Is that so, or is it one of your father's judgments?" Harvey asked as he bent to his oars. He felt he was learning to handle them more easily.
"Dad ain't mistook this time. Penn's a sure enough loony. No, he ain't that exactly. So much as a harmless idjit. It was this way. You're rowing quite so, Harve. And I tell you 'cause it's right you oughter know. He was a Moravian preacher once. Jacob Boller was his name, Dad told me, and he lived with his wife and 4 children somewheres out Pennsylvania way. Well, Penn, he took his folks along to a Moravian meeting, camp meeting most like, and they stayed over just one night in Johnstown. You've heerd talk of Johnstown?" Harvey considered. "Yes, I have, but I don't know why. It sticks in my head same as Ashtabula." "Both was big accidents, that's why, Harv. Well, that one single night Penn and his folks was to the hotel, Johnstown was wiped out. Dam bustin' flooded her, and the houses struck adrift and bumped into each other and sunk. I've seen the pictures, and they're dreadful. Penn, he saw his folks drowned all in a heap 'fore he rightly knew what was comin'. His mind give out from that on. He mistrusted somethin' had happened up to Johnstown, but for the poor life of him he couldn't remember what, and he just drifted around, smilin' and wonderin'. He didn't know what he was, nor yet what he had been. In that way he run agin Uncle Salters, who was visitin' Allegheny City. Half my mother's folks they live scattered inside of Pennsylvania, and Uncle Salters he visits around winters. Uncle Salters he kind of adopted Penn, well knowin' what his trouble was, and he brought him east, and he give him work on his farm." "Why, I heard him callin' Penn a farmer last night when the boats bumped. Is your Uncle Salters a farmer?" "Farmer!" shouted Dan. "There ain't water enough 'tween here and Hatteras to wash the fur mold off of his boots. He's just everlastin' farmer. Why, Harve, I've seen that man hitch up a bucket 'long towards sundown and set twiddlin' the spigot to the scuttle-butt same as 'twas a cow's bag. He's that much farmer. Well, Penn and he, they ran the farm, up Exeter way 'twas. Uncle Salters he sold it this spring to a jay from Boston as wanted to build a summer house, and he got a heap for it. Well, them 2 loonies scratched along till, one day, Penn's church he'd belonged to, the Moravians, found out where he was drifted and layin', and wrote to Uncle Salters. Never heerd what they said exactly, but Uncle Salters was mad. He's a Episcopalian mostly, but he just let 'em have it both sides of the bow, 'sif he was a Baptist, and says he warn't goin' to give up Penn to any blame Moravian connection in Pennsylvania or anywheres else. Then he came to Dad, towin' Penn. That was 2 trips back, and says he and Penn must fish a trip for their health. Guess he thought the Moravians wouldn't hunt the banks for Jacob Boller. Dad was agreeable, for Uncle Salters had been fishin' off and on for 30 years, when he warn't inventing patent manures, and he took quarter share in the We're Here, and the trip done Penn so much good, Dad made a habit of taking him. Some day, Dad says, he'll remember his wife and kids and Johnstown, and then, like as not, he'll die, Dad says. Don't you talk about Johnstown nor such things to Penn, or Uncle Salters he'll heave you overboard." "Poor Penn," murmured Harvey. "I should never have thought Uncle Salters cared for him by the look of 'em together." "I like Penn, though. We all do," said Dan. "We ought to have give him a tow, but I wanted to tell you first." They were close to the schooner now, the other boats a little behind them.
"You needn't heave in the dories till after dinner," said Troop, from the deck. "We'll dress down right off. Fix table, boys."
"Deeper'n the Whale deep," said Dan, with a wink, as he set the gear for dressing down. "Look at them boats that have edged up since mornin'. They're all waitin' on Dad. See 'em, Harve?" "They are all alike to me." And indeed, to a landsman, the nodding schooners around seemed run from the same mold. "They ain't, though. That yaller dirty packet with its bowsprit steeved that way, she's the Hope of Prague. Nick Brady's her skipper, the meanest man on the banks. We'll tell him so when we strike the main ledge. Way off yonder's the Day's Eye. The 2 Geralds own her. She's from Harwich, fastish, too, and has good luck, but Dad he'd find fish in a graveyard. Them other 3 side along, they're the Margie Smith, Rose, and Edith C. Whalen, all from home. Guess we'll see the Abiam Deering tomorrow, Dad, won't we? They're all slippin' over from the shoal o' Quiro."
"You won't see many boats tomorrow, Danny." When Troop called his son Danny, it was a sign that the old man was pleased. "Boys, we're too crowded," he went on, addressing the crew as they clambered inboard. "We'll leave 'em to bait big and catch small." He looked at the catch in the pen, and it was curious to see how little and level the fish ran. Save for Harvey's halibut, there was nothing over 15 pounds on deck. "I'm waiting on the weather," he added.
"You'll have to make it yourself, Disko, for there's no sign I can see," said Long Jack, sweeping the clear horizon. And yet, half an hour later, as they were dressing down, the bank fog dropped on them, between fish and fish, as they say. It drove steadily and in wreaths, curling and smoking along the colorless water. The men stopped dressing down without a word. Long Jack and Uncle Salters slipped the windlass brakes into their sockets, and began to heave up the anchor, the windlass jarring as the wet hempen cable strained on the barrel. Manuel and Tom Platt gave a hand at the last. The anchor came up with a sob, and the riding sail bellied as Troop steadied her at the wheel. "Up jib and foresail," said he. "Slip 'em in the smother," shouted Long Jack, making fast the jib sheet, while the others raised the clacking, rattling rings of the foresail, and the foreboom creaked as the We're Here looked up into the wind and dived off into blank, whirling white. "There's wind behind this fog," said Troop. It was all wonderful beyond words to Harvey, and the most wonderful part was that he heard no orders except an occasional grunt from Troop, ending with, "That's good, my son." "Never seen anchor weighed before?" said Tom Platt to Harvey, gaping at the damp canvas of the foresail. "No. Where are we goin'?" "Fish and make berth, as you'll find out 'fore you've been a week aboard. It's all new to you, but we never know what may come to us. Now take me, Tom Platt. I'd never ha' thought—" "It's better than $14 a month and a bullet in your belly," said Troop from the wheel. "Ease your jumbo a grind." "Dollars and cents better," returned the man-o'-war's man, doing something to a big jib with a wooden spar tied to it. "But we didn't think of that when we manned the windlass brakes on the Miss Jim Buck, outside Beaufort Harbor, with Fort Macon heavin' hot shot at our stem, and a livin' gale atop of all. Where was you then, Disko?" "Just here or hereabouts," Disko replied, "earnin' my bread on the deep waters, and dodgin' Reb privateers. Sorry I can't accommodate you with red-hot shot, Tom Platt, but I guess we'll come out all right on wind 'fore we see Eastern Point." There was an incessant slapping and chatter at the bows now, varied by a solid thud and a little spout of spray that clattered down on the forecastle. The rigging dripped clammy drops, and the men lounged along the lee of the house, all save Uncle Salters, who sat stiffly on the main hatch, nursing his stung hands. "Guess she'd carry staysail," said Disko, rolling one eye at his brother. "Guess she wouldn't to any sort o' profit. What's the sense of wastin' canvas?" the farmer sailor replied. The wheel twitched almost imperceptibly in Disko's hands. A few seconds later a hissing wave-top slashed diagonally across the boat, smote Uncle Salters between the shoulders, and drenched him from head to foot. He rose sputtering, and went forward, only to catch another. "See Dad chase him all around the deck," said Dan. "Uncle Salters, he thinks his quarter share's our canvas. Dad's put this duckin' act up on him 2 trips runnin'. Hi, that found him where he feeds." Uncle Salters had taken refuge by the foremast, but a wave slapped him over the knees. Disko's face was as blank as the circle of the wheel. "Guess she'd lie easier under staysail, Salters," said Disko, as though he had seen nothing. "Set your old kite, then," roared the victim through a cloud of spray. "Only don't lay it to me if anything happens. Then you go below right off and get your coffee. And you ought to have more sense than to bum around on deck this weather." "Now they'll swill coffee and play checkers till the cows come home,"
said Dan, as Uncle Salters hustled Penn into the fore cabin. "Looks to me like's if we'd all be doin' so for a spell. There's nothin' in creation deader limpsy idler'n a banker when she ain't on fish." "I'm glad ye spoke, Danny," cried Long Jack, who had been casting round in search of amusement. "I'd clean forgot we'd got a passenger under that T-wharf hat. There's no idleness for thim that don't know their ropes. Pass him along, Tom Platt, and we'll larn him."
"'Tain't my trick this time," grinned Dan. "You've got to go it alone. Dan learned me with a rope's end." For an hour Long Jack walked his prey up and down, teaching, as he said, things at the sea that ivery man must know, blind, drunk, or asleep. There is not much gear to a 70-ton schooner with a stump foremast, but Long Jack had a gift of expression. When he wished to draw Harvey's attention to the peak halyards, he dug his knuckles into the back of the boy's neck and kept him at gaze for half a minute. He emphasized the difference between fore and aft generally by rubbing Harvey's nose along a few feet of the boom, and the lead of each rope was fixed in Harvey's mind by the end of the rope itself. The lesson would have been easier had the deck been at all free, but there appeared to be a place on it for everything and anything except a man. Forward lay the windlass and its tackle, with the chain and hemp cables, all very unpleasant to trip over, the forecastle stovepipe, and the gurry butts by the forecastle hatch to hold the fish livers. Aft of these the foreboom and booby of the main hatch took all the space that was not needed for the pumps and dressing pens. Then came the nests of dories lashed to ring-bolts by the quarter-deck, the house, with tubs and oddments lashed all around it, and last, the 60-foot main-boom, in its crutch, splitting things lengthwise, to duck and dodge under every time. Tom Platt, of course, could not keep his oar out of the business, but ranged alongside with enormous and unnecessary descriptions of sails and spars on the old Ohio.
"Never mind what he says. Attend to me, innocents. Tom Platt, this ballyhoo's not the Ohio, and you're mixin' the boy bad."
"He'll be ruined for life, beginning on a fore and after this way," Tom Platt pleaded. "Give him a chance to know a few leadin' principles. Sailin's an art, Harvey, and I'll show you if I had you in the foretop o' the—"
"I know it. You'd talk him dead and cold. Silence, Tom Platt.
Now, after all I've said, how'd you reef the foresail, Harv? Take your time answerin'." "Haul that in," said Harvey, pointing to leeward.
"What? The North Atlantic?"
"No, the boom. Then run that rope you showed me back there."
"That's no way," Tom Platt burst in. "Quiet. He's larnin', and his not the name's good yet. Go on, Harv."
"Oh, it's the reef pennant. I'd hook the tackle onto the reef pennant, and then let down—" "Lower the sail, child, lower," said Tom Platt in a professional agony. "Lower the throat and peak halyards," Harvey went on. Those names stuck in his head.
"Lay your hand on 'em,"
said Long Jack. Harvey obeyed. "Lower till that rope-lope on the after leech no, it's cringle, till the cringle was down on the boom. Then I'd tie her up the way you said, and then I'd hoist up the peak and throat halyards again."
"You've forgot to pass the tack earing, but with time and help you'll learn. There's good and just reason for every rope aboard, or else 'twould be overboard. Do you follow me? 'Tis dollars and cents I'm puttin' into your pocket, you skinny little supercargo, so that when you're filled out you can ship from Boston to Cuba, and tell 'em Long Jack larned you. Now I'll chase you around a piece, callin' the ropes, and you lay your hand on 'em as I call."
He began, and Harvey, who was feeling rather tired, walked slowly to the rope named. A rope's end licked round his ribs, and nearly knocked the breath out of him. "When you own a boat," said Tom Platt, with severe eyes, "you can walk. Till then, take all orders at the run. Once more, to make sure." Harvey was in a glow with the exercise, and this last cut warmed him thoroughly. Now he was a singularly smart boy, the son of a very clever man and a very sensitive woman,
with a fine resolute temper that systematic spoiling had nearly turned to mulish obstinacy. He looked at the other men, and saw that even Dan did not smile. It was evidently all in a day's work, though it hurt abominably, so he swallowed the hint with a gulp and a gasp and a grin. The same smartness that led him to take such advantage of his mother made him very sure that no one on the boat, except maybe Penn, would stand the least nonsense. One learns a great deal from a mere tone. Long Jack called over half a dozen more ropes, and Harvey danced over the deck like an eel at ebb tide, one eye on Tom Platt. Very good done," said Manuel. "After supper I show you a little schooner I make, with all her ropes. So we shall learn."
"First class, for a passenger," said Dan. "Dad, he's just allowed you be wuth your salt, maybe, 'fore you drowned. That's a heap for Dad. I'll learn you more our next watch together."
"Taller," grunted Disko, peering through the fog as it smoked over the bows. There was nothing to be seen 10 feet beyond the surging jib boom, while alongside rolled the endless procession of solemn, pale waves, whispering and upping one to the other. "Now I'll learn you something Long Jack can't," shouted Tom Platt, as from a locker by the stern he produced a battered deep-sea lead hollowed at one end, smeared the hollow from a saucer full of mutton tallow, and went forward. "I'll learn you how to fly the Blue Pigeon. Shoo!" Disko did something to the wheel that checked the schooner's way, while Manuel, with Harvey to help, and a proud boy was Harvey, let down the jib in a lump on the boom. The lead sung a deep droning song as Tom Platt whirled it round and round. "Go ahead, man," said Long Jack impatiently. "We're not drawing 25 foot off Fire Island in a fog. There's no trick to it." "Don't be jealous, Galway." The released lead plopped into the sea far ahead as the schooner surged slowly forward.
"Soundin' is a trick, though," said Dan. "When your dipsy lead's all the eye you're like to hev for a week. What do you make it, Dad?" Disko's face relaxed. His skill and honor were involved in the march he had stolen on the rest of the fleet, and he had his reputation as a master artist who knew the banks blindfold.
60, maybe, if I'm any judge," he replied, with a glance at the tiny compass in the window of the house.
60,
sung out Tom Platt, hauling in great wet coils. The schooner gathered way once more. "Heave," said Disko, after a quarter of an hour.
"What do you make it?" Dan whispered, and he looked at Harvey proudly. But Harvey was too proud of his own performances to be impressed just then.
50, said the father. "I mistrust we're right over the nick of Green Bank on old 65.
50,
roared Tom Platt. They could scarcely see him through the fog.
"She's bust within a yard, like the shells at Fort Macon." "Bait up, Harv," said Dan, diving for a line on the reel. The schooner seemed to be straying promiscuously through the smother, her headsail banging wildly. The men waited and looked at the boys, who began fishing.
"Ha!"
Dan's lines twitched on the scored and scarred rail. "Now how in thunder did Dad know? Help us here, Harv. It's a big 'un. Poke hook, too." They hauled together, and landed a goggle-eyed 20-pound cod. He had taken the bait right into his stomach. "Why, he's all covered with little crabs," cried Harvey, turning him over.
"By the great hook block, they're lousy already," said Long Jack. "Disko, you keep your spare eyes under the keel."
Splash went the anchor, and they all heaved over the lines, each man taking his place at the bulwarks.
"Are they good to eat?" Harvey panted as he lugged in another crab-covered cod. "Sure. When they're lousy, it's a sign they've all been herdin' together by the thousand, and when they take the bait that way, they're hungry. Never mind how the bait sets, they'll bite on the bare hook." "Say, this is great!" Harvey cried as the fish came in gasping and splashing, nearly all poke-hooked, as Dan had said. "Why can't we always fish from the boat instead of from the dories?" "Allus can, till we begin to dress down. Efter that, the heads and offals 'd scare the fish to Fundy. Boat fishin' ain't reckoned progressive, though, unless you know as much as Dad knows. Guess we'll run out our trawl to-night. Harder on the back this than from the dory, ain't it?"
It was rather back-breaking work, for in a dory the weight of a cod is water-borne till the last minute, and you are, so to speak, abreast of him, but the few feet of a schooner's freeboard make so much extra dead-hauling, and stooping over the bulwarks cramps the stomach. But it was wild and furious sport so long as it lasted, and a big pile lay aboard when the fish ceased biting.
"Where's Penn and Uncle Salters?" Harvey asked, slapping the slime off his oilskins, and reeling up the line in careful imitation of the others. "Gets coffee and see." Under the yellow glare of the lamp on the pawl-post, the forecastle table down and opened, utterly unconscious of fish or weather, sat the two men, a checkerboard between them, Uncle Salters snarling at Penn's every move.
"What's the matter now?"
said the former, as Harvey, one hand in the leather loop at the head of the ladder, hung shouting to the cook.
"Big fish and lousy. Heaps and heaps," Harvey replied, quoting Long Jack. "How's the game?"
Little Penn's jaw dropped.
"'Tweren't none o' his fault," snapped Uncle Salters. "Penn's deef."
"Checkers, weren't it?" said Dan, as Harvey staggered aft with the steaming coffee and a tin pail. "That lets us out of cleanin' up to-night. Dad's a just man. They'll have to do it."
"And two young fellers I know'll bait up a tub or so of trawl while they're cleanin'," said Disko, lashing the wheel to his taste.
Guess I'd rather clean up, Dad."
"Don't doubt it. You won't, though. Dress down. Dress down. Penn'll pitch while you two bait up."
"Why in thunder didn't them blame boys tell us you'd struck on?"
said Uncle Salters, shuffling to his place at the table.
"This knife's gum blunt, Dan."
"If stickin' out cable don't wake you, guess you better hire a boy of your own," said Dan, muddling about in the dusk over the tubs full of trawl line lashed to windward of the house. "Oh, Harve, don't you want to slip down and git's bait?"
"Bait as we are," said Disko. "I mistrust shag fishin' will pay better, as things go." That meant the boys would bait with selected offal of the cod as the fish were cleaned, an improvement on paddling barehanded in the little bait barrels below. The tubs were full of neatly coiled line carrying a big hook every few feet, and the testing and baiting of every single hook, with the stowage of the baited line so that it should run clear when shot from the dory, was a scientific business. Dan managed it in the dark without looking, while Harvey caught his fingers on the barbs and bewailed his fate. But the hooks flew through Dan's fingers like tatting on an old maid's lap.
"I helped bait up trawl ashore 'fore I could well walk," he said, "but it's a putterin' job all the same. Oh, Dad!" This shouted towards the hatch where Disko and Tom Platt were salting. "How many skates you reckon we'll need?"
"'Bout 3. Hurry."
"There's 300 fathom to each tub," Dan explained. "More'n enough to lay out to-night. Ouch! Slipped up there, I did." He stuck his finger in his mouth. "I tell you, Harve, there ain't money in Gloucester'd hire me to ship on a regular trawler. It may be progressive, but, barrin' that, it's the putterin'est, slim-jammest business top of earth." "I don't know what this is, if 'tisn't regular trawlin'," said Harvey sulkily. "My fingers are all cut to frazzles." "Pshaw! This is jest one o' Dad's blame experiments. He don't trawl 'less there's mighty good reason fer it. Dad knows. That's why he's baitin' as he is. We'll have her saggin' full when we take her up, or we won't see a fin."
Penn and Uncle Salters cleaned up as Disko had ordained, but the boys profited little. No sooner were the tubs furnished than Tom Platt and Long Jack, who had been exploring the inside of a dory with a lantern, snatched them away, loaded up the tubs in some small, painted trawl buoys, and hove the boat overboard into what Harvey regarded as an exceedingly rough sea.
"They'll be drowned. Why, the dory's loaded like a freight car," he cried.
"We'll be back," said Long Jack. and in case you're not looking for us, we'll lay into you both if the trawl's snarled." The dory surged up on the crest of a wave, and just when it seemed impossible that she could avoid smashing against the schooner's side, slid over the ridge and was swallowed up in the damp dusk.
"Take a hold here, and keep ringing steady,"
said Dan, passing Harvey the lanyard of a bell that hung just behind the windlass. Harvey rang lustily, for he felt 2 lives depended on him. But Disko in the cabin, scrawling in the logbook, did not look like a murderer, and when he went to supper he even smiled dryly at the anxious Harvey.
"This ain't no weather," said Dan. "Why, you and me could set that trawl. They've only gone out just far enough so as not to foul our cable. They don't need no bell, really."
Clang, clang, clang. Harvey kept it up, varied with occasional rub-a-dubs, for another half-hour. There was a bellow and a bump alongside. Manuel and Dan raced to the hooks of the dory tackle. Long Jack and Tom Platt arrived on deck together, it seemed, one half the North Atlantic at their backs, and the dory followed them in the air, landing with a clatter. "Nary a snarl," said Tom Platt as he dripped. "Danny, you'll do yet." "The pleasure of your company to the banquet," said Long Jack, squelching the water from his boots as he capered like an elephant and stuck an oilskinned arm into Harvey's face. "We do be condescended to honor the second half with our presence." And off they all 4 rolled to supper, where Harvey stuffed himself to the brim on fish chowder and fried pies, and fell fast asleep just as Manuel produced from a locker a lovely 2-foot model of the Lucy Holmes, his first boat, and was going to show Harvey the ropes. Harvey never even twiddled his fingers as Penn pushed him into his bunk.
"It must be a sad thing, a very sad thing," said Penn, watching the boy's face, "for his mother and his father, who think he's dead. To lose a child, to lose a man-child." "Get out of this, Penn," said Dan. "Go aft and finish your game with Uncle Salters. Tell Dad I'll stand Harv's watch if he don't keer. He's played out."
"Very good boy," said Manuel, slipping out of his boots and disappearing into the black shadows of the lower bunk. "Spec he make good man, Danny. I no see he is any so mad as your papa he says. Eh, what?" Dan chuckled, but the chuckle ended in a snore. It was thick weather outside, with a rising wind, and the elder men stretched their watches. The hours struck clear in the cabin. The nosing bows slapped and scuffled with the seas. The forecastle stovepipe hissed and sputtered as the spray caught it, and the boys slept on, while Disko, Long Jack, Tom Platt, and Uncle Salters, each in turn, stumped aft to look at the wheel, forward to see that the anchor held, or to veer out a little more cable against chafing, with a glance at the dim anchor light between each round. End of chapter.